Mumblecore is a controversial term coined sarcastically that most of the people involved in dislike and to an extent have disowned. Some of the key people involved in Mumblecore even made a short film satirising the whole concept, which to be fair probably solidified it as a thing in some people's eyes. So why is Mumblecore now commonly accepted as a film movement? To answer this question, we need to look at what a film movement actually is. There's no absolute definition, but Andrew Tudor defined film movements as a distinct cluster of films representing a break with films of the past. I actually would go a bit further than that and suggest that to define a group of films as a film movement, we need to see evidence that the break with the past has influenced other filmmakers who have built on it in their work. It's commonly accepted that most film movements follow a similar trajectory in that there's an original boundary-pushing work and then clusters of movies that build on it. Filmmakers will then build on the themes and new ideas in these clusters, and further clusters will follow. These clusters together form cycles. It can be argued that film movements are basically a bunch of these cycles, leading on from each other and building on the thematic and aesthetic similarities they share, while simultaneously new ideas are added and built upon. Most film movements start with a seminal film that breaks with the past. For Mumblecore, this movie is Funny Ha Ha by Andrew Bujalski. The 2002 film is widely recognised as the original Mumblecore movie. It's about Marnie, a college graduate trying to navigate the world and relationships post-college. The film was made on a low budget and featured naturalistic dialogue, all things that would come to epitomise the Mumblecore film movement. It wasn't a massive commercial success, but it had a huge generative impact. A few years later at the 2005 South by Southwest Festival, 3 filmmakers showed films that basically formed the first cluster of Mumblecore movies. The Duplass brothers with The Puffy Chair, Joe Swanberg's Kissing on the Mouth and Andrew Bujalski's Mutual Appreciation. It was also at the 2005 festival that the name Mumblecore came about. Sound mixer Eric Matsunaga, who worked with Bujalski on Mutual Appreciation, used the term to describe the mumbling dialogue in the 3 films as a way to describe them collectively. Once it was out in the public domain, the term changed from a description of the sound to refer to a wider set of thematic and aesthetic similarities. In 2007, the New York Times described it as low-key naturalism, lo-fi production values, and a stream of low-volume chatter, often perceived as ineloquence. Over the next few years, the cycle of films made by filmmakers like Joe Swanberg, the Duplass brothers, Aaron Katz and Andrew Bujalski dealt with the themes and aesthetic choices made in Funny Ha Ha and built on them. This cluster of films would be the birth of Mumblecore as a movement. Over the next few years, up until around 2010, there were more clusters of movies that built on these key films, which taken together in context make up the first wave of Mumblecore. Films like Aaron Katz's Quiet City from 2007, Joe Swanberg's Hannah Takes the Stairs and Nights and Weekends from Joe Swanberg and future Oscar nominee Greta Gerwig all added to the movement and contributed to its evolution. So other than the dodgy sound quality, what links these films together and enables us to describe them as Mumblecore? The movement focuses on the specific experience of a specific group of people at a specific time. The first cycle of Mumblecore films was made between 2002 to 2010. What was it about this particular time in history that influenced these films? Apart from Funny Ha Ha, which was shot on 35mm film, Mumblecore movies were shot digitally. The rise of digital filmmaking in this time period meant that it had never been easier to shoot a movie at a quality that was theoretically fit for distribution. This definitely influenced the rise of Mumblecore because it had never been less expensive to make a film. Advances in technology made decent camera equipment cheaper and more accessible than ever. The Puffy Chair cost just $15,000.
We asked our parents for $15,000 to make the movie, and they gave it to us.
Filming digitally also meant that distribution was easier than ever. Films could be sent around the world in a matter of seconds. Coupled with the rise in popularity of video sharing sites like YouTube, it had literally never been easier to get your film out into the world. Looking at the naturalistic, low-budget style of these films, it's not hard to see where the movement benefited so much. It's a lot easier to make a good Mumblecore movie on a low budget than it is to make a special effect laden sci-fi movie. There are 2 main themes that come up again and again in Mumblecore. The first is relationships, specifically the relationships held by people in their early 20s. Many of the films focus on romantic relationships, dealing with breakups, conflict and uncertainty. The second theme is change. While Mumblecore films are almost entirely set in the present, the focus of the characters is usually what is going to happen in the future. I'm not suggesting that Mumblecore presents an entirely new, separate and distinct narrative structure or way of looking at patriarchy and gender, but they do bring something new to the table, informed by their social and political context. John Alberti describes, "We could even refer to these movies as postmodern neorealism, where postness functions as a defining existential condition of the characters. They are postgraduate, post-patriarchy, post-narrative and post-gender." These themes are usually more important to the filmmakers than the narrative, and more time is usually spent exploring these themes through dialogue than advancing the plot. Aesthetically, Mumblecore films didn't really utilise the standard Hollywood style of production we're currently used to in feature films until a lot later in the movement, almost getting into the post-Mumblecore cycle. At a glance, the most common aesthetic similarity between Mumblecore movies is the lo-fi look. Many Mumblecore films were filmed on consumer-grade cameras. Key scenes are often filmed with a handheld camera, and a lot of Mumblecore movies utilise a static long take in key scenes. The editing tends to be more meandering than what you might be used to, staying with shots for a longer time than is perhaps necessary. As you may expect from a movement sarcastically named after the sound quality, the sound tended to be incredibly lo-fi, and at some points it's almost difficult to make out the exact dialogue.
Which seems like that's like what a lot of plays are about. The most massive tragedy is that nobody really actually listens to each other.
The mise-en-scene in Mumblecore is incredibly naturalistic. Filming took place almost entirely on location rather than on set. Naturalistic lighting is used in abundance. Non-actors were cast in key roles and would usually be the director or friends of the director. Sometimes real-life couples portrayed couples in movies like The Puffy Chair. This meant that they were very naturalistic and the filmmakers could capture dialogue that felt as real as possible. Some films utilised improvisation, which felt even more realistic due to the pre-existing relationships between the characters. A lot of the ground Mumblecore covers isn't exactly brand new. You can point to Reality Bites as a film about post-college uncertainty. Kevin Smith's Clerks features a cast of non-actors and is a realistic look at the experience of young, middle-class Americans. If you want to evaluate the artistic worth of Mumblecore, you can also look at the influences that past film movements have had on the movement. Mumblecore films are naturalistic and portray characters and scenarios that are as close to real life as possible. This type of film was first made notable by the Italian neo-realism movement. These films were set in Italy post-World War II and were largely shot on location, featuring non-professional actors in key roles. Like Mumblecore, the movies were about the experiences of one socio-economic class, but the focus here was lower classes as opposed to the middle class experience shown in Mumblecore. Like Mumblecore, the movies are about the specific experience of a specific group of people at a specific time. You can also see the influence of the French New Wave movement, sometimes known as Nouvelle Vague. Like Mumblecore, it was created by a group of young, interconnected filmmakers who often use non-actors to portray characters in their films. The French New Wave was about rejecting the narrative structure and conventions of the films that came before. They were also criticised for seeming to be about nothing, so while it may cause anger to some cinephiles, it's easy to see the parallels with Mumblecore. Perhaps the Dogma 95 movement is one of the biggest influences on Mumblecore, as it was also a product of technological advancements and the resulting DIY culture. Like Mumblecore, the Dogma 95 movement was filmed naturalistically, with on-location sound and handheld camera work. However, in Dogma 95, the lo-fi look and sound are intentional due to a strict set of rules, whereas in Mumblecore, they are a byproduct. So the peak of the first wave of Mumblecore movies is pretty accurately represented by Lena Dunham, the filmmaker who has probably inspired 1,000 think pieces. Dunham's 2010 debut film Tiny Furniture exemplifies the Mumblecore movement and also the end of the first wave. The film centres around Aura, played by Dunham, and her experiences as she moves home after college, particularly her relationships with her mum and sister, who are played by her real-life mum and sister. This film led to Dunham landing a HBO series, Girls, which was an immediate hit and propelled Mumblecore sensibilities beyond the world of cult indie cinema and into the public domain.
I think that I may be the voice of my generation.
We then started to see bigger budget Mumblecore movies with higher production values. Frances Ha was directed by Noah Baumbach in 2012 and starred Greta Gerwig. Its focus on Frances and her attempts to make it as a dancer really build upon the themes in the first wave. You can also look at 2013's Drinking Buddies, which was directed by Joe Swanberg and featured big stars like Anna Kendrick and Olivia Wilde. There's also Blue Jay from 2016, which is written by and starred Mark Duplass. These movies retain the thematic focuses on relationships and change, but have dropped a lot of the aesthetic sensibilities, probably in part due to bigger budgets. So is Mumblecore a film movement? From the evidence here, we can definitely make a case that it is. Mumblecore movies brought something new to the table, and many filmmakers have built upon and developed these thematic and aesthetic choices, leading to further clusters and cycles to drive the movement forward. However, the themes and aesthetic sensibilities of Mumblecore can be described as quite basic. Yes, there are definite thematic and aesthetic links, but they're quite general. When you compare it to a movement like German Expressionism, which was usually generative and aesthetically striking, Mumblecore almost feels a bit lacking. While I'm perhaps being a bit unfair to compare a movement that has had almost 100 years to seep into the cultural fabric of film to one that hasn't yet been around for 20, you can see the difference. You could make a convincing argument that what I've just spent time defining as a movement is actually more accurately described as films that are superficially similar, made by filmmakers that know each other, rather than clusters and cycles of movies that have built upon each other and brought something new and unique to film. This is where I'm going to talk about Mumblegore. Mumblegore is a cycle of movies that take the naturalistic, low-budget, dialogue-heavy sensibilities of Mumblecore to the horror genre. The original Mumblecore film was probably Baghead, made by the Duplass brothers in 2009, a movie about a group of writers being chased around by someone with a bag on their head, which might be the most literal film title of all time. Since this, there have been loads of Mumblecore movies. There have been clusters of found footage movies like VHS and Creep 1 and 2, as the concept works particularly well with this. T. West is probably the most prolific Mumblecore filmmaker. For me, the fact that Mumblecore works as a movement across genres definitely shows that we can classify it as a film movement. While it might be controversial and not everyone's cup of tea, there is no denying the impact it's had. You can trace the movement from the original boundary-breaking work to the first cluster of Mumblecore movies, and then consider this as part of a larger first-wave cycle, alongside and before other cycles like German Mumblecore, post-Mumblecore and Mumblegore.